In this module, we are going to discuss the phrase, the practice inspector said. And this is something that I hear my colleagues say to me, and we're going to discuss it. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, it's a tough job being a practice inspector. You only get to look at the documentation, and if you've ever tried to review a file where you don't know the client, you will know how difficult that is to conclude on whether or not the audit's been done properly, because you're just looking at the documentation and you don't know the client. Now, in my experience, most practice inspectors are very good and know what they're talking about. The only issue may be that they know professional standards better than you do, and that can be a problem for you because they will point something out and you don't understand, and you will misunderstand what they're trying to tell you. Now, the other thing I found about documentation is I have left notes for myself in a file about how a difficult section was to be done, and I thought it was really clear when I did it in the first year. And then when I start reading it in the second year, I go, well, this doesn't make any sense at all. And when I finally figure out what was going on and decide to go back and fix the documentation, I look at it again and say, no, that's perfectly clear. So clarity of documentation is an interesting thing. Now, on the other hand, once I had a practice inspector tell me accounts receivable confirmations are required for all audits, and we hadn't done receivables confirmation, so he was trying to tell me we'd made a big mistake. I pointed out that the section did not require that. He was surprised. He was even more surprised when I pointed out the constraints on the reliability of confirmation in standards, 505A5 and 505A11. A5 says that you got to be careful that the confirmation might be signed without checking. And then he was even more astonished when his boss confirmed that I was right. So when you're dealing with a practice inspector, be nice and make sure that you know the standards. And for you to have a successful practice inspection, you have to know the standards every bit as well as the practice inspector, and maybe better. Now, the other thing to remember is the practice inspectors have no authority. If it's not in the standards, they can't say you have to do it. So they can't require you to do anything that's not in the standards. They also can't amend the standards or change the wording in the standards. Now, if you think they are, you've probably misunderstood. That's going to be my guess. They're trying to tell you something. They're trying to tell you that you're not doing something that's required in standards, and you're not getting it, and you're misunderstanding, and you think they're telling you to do something different than they're actually telling you. Now, the other problem is their determination that if it's not documented, it's not done. Now, if you're a practice inspector, you have to believe that that is true, because all you can look at is the documentation. So if you're charged with finding out whether an audit, for instance, is well done, all you can do is look at the documentation, and if you conclude that something is not documented, you say it's not done. Now, of course, the risk with that philosophy is something could be well documented and poorly done. And if you are telling people if it's not documented, it's not done, the risk is that people will start documenting things prettily, but not actually doing any work. Now, if it's well documented but poorly done, no one other than the staff doing it will know. And when you're reviewing the file, you won't be able to figure it out either. You might, but probably not. It's pretty, it must be done okay. And there's a risk to that, because if you've documented something but not really done it, It could be that there's a remaining risk of material misstatement that you haven't addressed. The financial statements could be wrong. You could be in trouble. So documenting things but poorly done is bad as well. Now, what the practice inspector probably meant is standards require something and you didn't do it. And your response was, well, we did do it. It's just not documented. And they say, well, if it's not documented, how can you demonstrate to me that you did it? And the conclusion is, if it's not documented, it's not done. So I think if you get that sentence from the practice inspector, it means you haven't documented in your file that you did something that's required by standards. So don't decide to develop a bunch of documentation. Decide to address the issue the way it's required in standards. Now, the other defense you have is, this is said several times in the handbook, it is neither necessary nor practicable for the auditor to document every matter considered. And that's in CQSM 1A202, 220A117, 320A7. And 320A7 is perhaps the most helpful because it says, for instance, if you've documented this, it also documents that. And so with the assistance of 230A7, you can go to the practice inspector and say, well, you say we had to document this, but professional standards say if we've documented this thing, that also documents what you're suggesting we should document, so we've done it. So 230A7 and any other conclusions that you can draw along the lines of 230A7, you'd better have at your fingertips when you're talking to the practice inspector. And if you do, they're probably going to give up more quickly than if you react in stunned silence and say, we're supposed to do that? I don't understand what you mean. And the practice inspector will then say, you have no idea how to do an audit. Here's what I think you should do. Now, one of my favorites is the statement that a GST reconciliation is required. And it's not. It's not in standards. Now, what the practice inspector probably meant was you have to do something on the GST payable, and you do in proportion to the risk of material misstatement. Doesn't have to be a GST reconciliation, but if you've done absolutely nothing and have absolutely no evidence in proportion to the risk of material misstatement that the GST payable is correct, you only here do a GST rec. And if you only here do a GST rec, well, you should also hear retail tax payable, sales tax payable, employee deductions payable, workers' comp payable, all kinds of other miscellaneous payables that as an auditor you need to obtain some evidence in response to risk of material misstatement. And a GST rec might do it, but one of the problems with the GST rec is there's so many variables about things that are taxable, zero-rated export tax, which expenses have input tax credits on them. So a clever staff person can spend 5 or 10 minutes, make a bunch of assumptions about what expense accounts have input tax credits in them, and come up with a GST rec that works. And it might just be papering the file, and the GST might just be wrong because the rec is there in the file, but it's only pretty documentation and it doesn't mean anything. And we haven't done anything substantive in proportion to risk of material misstatement to determine that the GST payable or RST or employee deductions or workers' comp and so on are appropriate. Now, the other problem with doing a GST rec in all audits, and some people say you have to do it in a review engagement too, and that's even more incorrect, is you start developing procedural audits, and you start developing a series of procedures that you do in all audits that are not in response to risk of material misstatement, so they're unnecessary in some audits, and you've got this list of procedures you do, but they may not be appropriate. They may not be enough, depending on what risk of material misstatement could be. So you're going to be inefficient or ineffective because you haven't done enough work in some circumstances. Now the other thing is staff, even though they don't necessarily know how to do audits that well, will sooner or later figure out that they're doing too much work. And then they will just say, well, okay, if you want me to do this stupid rec, which is absolutely meaningless, I'll just do one for you. And the GST rec is really easy to fake, unfortunately. So if you've heard you've got to do a GST rec all the time, and you told your staff to do it and not do another, perhaps more efficient and more effective procedure in response to risk of material misstatement, I can kind of bet that they faked the GST rec. Too many variables going into it that you can make too many assumptions, and you just make assumptions to make it work. So you're going to end up with too much time and potentially not enough work. And both of those things are bad. Both of those will annoy staff. Both of those will make staff decide they really don't want to be auditors and move on to something more interesting. The other thing, and I've had discussions with practice inspectors about it, they say a planning meeting is required, and it's not. 315.17 said planning discussions are required. And that's a really important thing to do to be efficient and effective. You must have planning meetings, or planning discussions, not meetings. Now, what the practice inspector means, probably, is that you did not plan as required by 315.17. You didn't do it right. And they may, and I've heard practice inspectors say, we tried many times to explain to you that you needed to have planning discussions and you never did, so we finally said have a meeting. Maybe you'll understand that. And that's where that probably comes from. Now, the other thing, 315.17, very clear, the engagement partner has to be involved. The experience, expertise, knowledge, understanding of the engagement partner are vital to doing proper planning, are vital to properly assessing risk of material misstatement by assertion. So what I've seen sometimes is firms go, oh, we have to have a planning meeting. Okay, we'll get a manager. We don't need the partner there. And we'll call it a planning meeting and say, okay, we had a planning meeting. Practice inspector, you told us to have a planning meeting, and we did. You didn't comply with 315.17. It's also wrong. So just having a planning meeting with a manager and a bunch of staff does no good at all. It doesn't meet the requirements of 315.17, which requires the engagement partner to be there. Something that colleagues have told me the practice inspector told them to do was to add an element of unpredictability, to do unpredictable tests. Now, that is a requirement in standards. 240.30 says to address the risk of material misstatement due to fraudulent financial reporting at the financial statement level, assign and supervise staff properly. Well, we should always do that, and you might even have a checklist step that says I assigned and supervised staff properly. I evaluated the selection of accounting policies. I think we always do that, either for material misstatement due to error or material misstatement due to fraudulent financial reporting. So we might document that we always do that. And then it says add an element of unpredictability. So to do that, do we randomly test a series of immaterial amounts that we didn't test last year? Well, that won't find fraudulent financial reporting. That won't find anything. We're testing immaterial transactions and balances. We're not going to find a material misstatement. And some people also interpreted this to mean in all audits. Well, that's not what standards say, and I don't think that's what the practice inspector said. No, you don't always do it. You only do it in response to an assessed level of risk of material misstatement of fraudulent financial reporting. Now, when you do the required assessment of risk of material misstatement by component, by assertion, as required by 315, you have to say why. I think risk of material misstatement is high, moderate, low. Well, I guess you don't have to say low, but if you say high or moderate, you have to say why, because unless you say why, staff can't figure out what they should do in response. And is it risk of material misstatement due to error or fraudulent financial reporting? So you need to say that, and absent a description in the plan of an assessed risk of material misstatement of fraudulent financial reporting, you don't have to do anything, because it doesn't say you have to. It says it's only done in response to an assessed risk of material misstatement of fraudulent financial reporting. Now we can take some hints from 330, which says we may do some things. One of the things we may do is emphasize the need for professional skepticism. I think we might always document that we did that. I emphasize to staff that they should use professional skepticism. We should assign proper staff. I think we might document I assign proper staff. We might do the audit a bit differently each year so the client can't predict what we're going to do. Even better is not let the client know how we're doing it so they can't predict it. Then we're always unpredictable. And unpredictability in the selection of further audit procedures. And again, we should always do that, and I would suggest that what we should do is document all the time that we did that to bring in that element of unpredictability, either in normal audit procedures or in audit procedures directed at the risk of material misstatement of fraudulent financial reporting. So I don't think the practice inspector said you always need to do some random, unpredictable testing of some immaterial accounts that you normally wouldn't look at because you don't need to. I think they said exactly what professional standards say, so you need to know what professional standards say, and then you can properly respond to what the practice inspector said. The other thing I've sometimes dealt with is the practice inspector say, well, wouldn't you agree with me that? And if you say yes, they're saying, in my judgment, I don't think there's enough done in the plan, and I want some more procedures done. Wouldn't you agree with me that more analytical procedures should be done? And my favorite answer is no. And you then say, well, okay, let me show you where, in my view, let's assume it's a review engagement, and they say, wouldn't you agree more analytical procedures should have been done, or analysis? And then demonstrate why you think the procedures done, the analytical procedures done, are enough in the file, in the circumstances of the file, and in accordance with standards. Now, if you say yes, you're going to get an observation that in all review engagements, you need to do more analytical procedures, and you're going to start to get layers and layers of unnecessary things done in the file because you said, okay, I agree. And anyway, the practice inspector was probably talking about a particular file. They weren't talking about all files. So maybe you go and need to look at that file, and maybe you might just say, you know what, in that file, maybe we didn't do enough. So I'm happy to make a note to that partner in that file that more analysis needs to be done. But I think we're fine on all other review engagements. So you've got to be very careful with that as you extrapolate a deficiency in one file to all files. So don't do that. So what you need to do to deal with the practice inspector is you need to understand standards to prove that what you are doing is okay or to refute what the practice inspector is saying. If the practice inspector tells you something and quotes a standard and you look at them like you've never heard of it before, you're going to get into trouble. And the practice inspector may then say, well, seeing you have no idea what I'm talking about, and you have no idea that you have to do, for instance, some work on the GST payable, I'm going to say I think you should do a GST rec. So you haven't understood what the practice inspector is saying to you because you haven't understood standards. And if you get into that second situation where you don't understand, you're going to end up doing a GST rec in all audits, annoying staff, even if it's not necessary. You're going to be layering on procedure after procedure after unnecessary procedure. And you're then going to say, well, the practice inspector told me, and if you look carefully, well, the practice inspector probably didn't. So, thanks for listening.